I've got here is, well, the basic overview of the results, which shouldn't come as news to anyone in this room, I wouldn't imagine, but Labor were down 8 seats from a post redistribution 54. They won 53 in 2021, but the new seat of Oakford was created, which bumped it up to 54. It was the Nationals who bore the brunt of the redistribution. 2 of their seats were essentially merged into one. So the Nationals did well to win 6 seats, up 3 on post-it redistribution terms, but they did in fact win 4 in 2021. A part of the moral of that story, which I will get to, is that it was a better result in regional terms for the Conservative parties than it was in the metropolitan area. So the Liberals managed to gain 4 seats. 3 of them were in the metropolitan area. One of them was Murray-Wellington, which is borderline metro and non-metro. Well, it's non-metropolitan, but it's very semi-rural. So the Nationals, however, got the best bang for the buck because you were seeing very big swings, particularly in regional city seats. I think a theme that I might be picking out a little bit over the course of the next few slides is that there's a lot of commonality here between this result and the Queensland result, except in absolute terms. The Queensland result was a bad result for Labor. They had state election, Labor lost power in October 2024. So at a macro level, it was a very different election from this one. But in terms of how the regional breakdowns played out, there were a lot of commonalities there. Labor absolutely got wiped out in Queensland. They held on to a couple of seats outside of South East Queensland, 1 or 2, but they were losing seats like Mackay and Rockhampton that they had never lost before. And similarly, not as badly in Western Australia, obviously, but Labor were very heavily defeated in Geraldton. They were quite badly defeated in Albany, which they'd held since 2001, whereas in the metropolitan area, the 2021 landslide came surprisingly close to holding up. So what I have there, I guess, is swings over the space of 2 elections. I'm going to spend a lot of time comparing this election result to 2017 because the 2021 result was so extraordinary. And not just the Queensland comparison, I think the patterns you're seeing between 2017 and 2025 are evident throughout the Western world. We are seeing Conservative parties get weaker in the big city wealthy areas that used to be the bedrock of support for centre-right parties. They are now culturally alienated from those parties, and by conversely, centre-left parties are having a very hard time winning seats outside large metropolitan areas. Next slide. Okay, to illustrate that point, I have broken down the pattern of results into 6 somewhat crudely defined regions, and I am comparing the 2017 result with the 2025 result here in terms of how the swing went. And to illustrate the point that I was just making about how much centre-left parties are struggling in regional areas, Labor have gone backward in what I call regional/city. So we're talking Albany, Bunbury, Kalgoorlie, Geraldton. I think I throw Collie Preston in there as well. These are the sorts of areas in which Labor did very badly at the Queensland election and relatively badly here at the state election. On the metropolitan fringes, Labor did as well in 2017 at this election as last time. Not better, but as well, which I think they can be reasonably happy with. But you did see very big swings. I think if I had broken this down and included a 2021 column, you would have seen pretty violent fluctuation across those 3 elections. Labor lost Kalamunda. There were big swings in seats like West Swan. I'll shortly bring up a map that will bring this point home. Labor did very extraordinarily well in the outer metropolitan area in 2021. That snapped back this time, but Labor held their own compared to 2017, which by any historical standard is an excellent result. The other point that I've made about where centre-right parties are going backwards, that comes through in what I've calculated to be positive swings in inner city and Liberal heartland. Liberal heartland is not just the western suburbs. I'm including Bateman and I think Riverton. Anything on a waterfront base, well, not anything, but That it helps that it's on a waterfront, good real estate values there, professional classes living there, and that used to be, the Liberal Party heartland. These are the sorts of seats that are being lost to Teals. At this election, we saw Labor almost hold on in Churchlands. They lost Churchlands, they lost Nedlands, but by any historical standard, these were outstanding results. A lot of the independent vote from Cottesloe, which was quite high, ends up in the Labor column according to my calculation, and Labor won Bateman, which is not a seat that they would ordinarily expect to come anywhere near winning. So when you compare those results to 2017, that represents movement of Labor. And you're also seeing that in the inner city, which again, we're talking about affluent, well-educated people, but these are sort of seats that are culturally more left-leaning historically than, Churchlands, Nedlands and Cottesloe. It's a swing to Labor across those two elections, so you're seeing Labor improve their performance between 2017 and 2025 in seats like Perth and Mount Lawley. Next slide. I should make sure that I didn't miss anything here. Okay, so the Liberal recovery was notably weak in the Parklands Hartley seats, which was especially notable on the night in Churchlands, but that was not the only example. I have a too clever by half map to illustrate all of this, where I've...
Sorry, we just had to flip.
And as well as being difficult to bring up, I have broken it down by SA1, which probably wasn't necessary. But I hope that you can see that this is a visual representation of Labor or Liberal swing between 2017 and 2022, and what you're seeing is a lot of red in inner urban areas and a lot of blue in outer urban areas, especially in Kalamunda, the seat that Labor lost. You're seeing a lot of blue in that sort of southern corridor. My theory as to what's happening there is that Labor had a pretty juiced up vote in those sorts of seats for a couple of electoral cycles. I think a lot of this is to do with the Perth to Mandurah rail line. In 2013, Labor held up in these sorts of seats. They were getting absolutely pummeled everywhere in 2013, which is a point that I'll shortly come to. But in 2013, the Labor vote held up in those sorts of seats. And I think that what you were seeing there was a bit of a dividend from the rail line. And that's sort of starting to play out now, and those seats are reverting to some sort of equilibrium. However, we've also got at the northern end of the coastal metropolitan area apparently movement from Labor to Liberal. I'm not exactly sure what I'm measuring here, to be honest. I think it's 2017 to 22. I may have standardised it so that the median is sort of zero, but it just shows the point of it is to show, relatively speaking, where Labor has gotten stronger and where Labor has gotten weaker since 2017. So the next slide. All right, what have I got?
Historical perspective.
I could say that much. I did get my eyes tested the other day, and I would have done well on the top line, but less so on the next one. All right, I estimate that Labor's statewide two-party preferred vote at this election was 57.1. That required estimates in 7 seats. I've seen other estimates that were a little bit higher for Labor for mine, so I think my estimates of how many preferences Labor was getting in seats where it wasn't first and second Labor and Liberal, I had to make my own punt. But I doubt that I'm far off. So 57.1%, maybe in one day the Western Australian Electoral Commission, when they've got nothing else on, will do two-party counts for those seats, but for the time being all I can do is estimate. So this was absolutely Labor's second strongest performance historically, by which I mean better than 2017, which 2017 I don't think that Labor had ever done that well in an election before. We remember the sort of first 2 Brian Burke wins as being big landslides, but they were put into the shade by the last 3 elections, including the relatively modest result in 2017. So we are seeing seats with absolutely no precedent for Labor holding. South Perth, Bateman and Dawesville are all there. South Perth has a very long history. I take it we've got an incumbent here. Congratulations to that successful candidate. You've done very well, obviously, stating the obvious here. And I think that would have been in my Liberal heartland bucket as sort of seats that have moved heavily to Labor from 2017 to 2025. Dawesville doesn't have a long history. It basically is new development, but for all the time that it has existed since the 1990s, it looked like a safe Liberal seat. I don't remember what the margin in Dawesville was. I think it's sort of about 4%. You know, historically speaking, Labor are punching enormously above their weight in that seat. In two-party preferred terms, though, this election was actually sort of in the ballpark of what Colin Barnett managed in 2013. And look what happened to him 4 years later, lest anyone get too cocky. So 57.3% was the coalition. You're not supposed to say coalition in Western Australia, but I think I'll do it anyway. The coalition two-party preferred was basically similar to that. And yet, the Labor did a lot better at that election than the Liberal and National parties did at this one. So Labor's vote was quite efficiently distributed, and I think that this might be a marker to the electoral purist in me isn't happy about this, but the Labor partisans out there should be. I think that we're looking at a future similar to South Australia, where the Liberal Party struggles to win elections even when they win the two-party preferred vote. This is because too much of the Conservative vote is locked up in safe non-metropolitan seats. This is that sort of sorting effect I've referred to. The metropolitan area is becoming pretty much, apart from a couple of regional seats, the only places where Labor wins seats. That means Labor are winning lots and lots of seats off fairly modest margins in the metropolitan area, while the Liberals and Nationals are blowing up 20% plus margins in country seats that aren't doing them any good. So Labor did markedly better in 2013. I made that point. Labor won 21 seats in 2013. Compare that with the how many that they won between them, 13, that the Liberals and Nationals won between them, off a similar two-party preferred vote. No one sort of noticed that phenomenon much at this election, but if at a future election we come in at 50-50, people are going to notice then. And I suspect the redistribution commissioners, when they redraw the boundaries, are going to face a bit of subtle pressure to craftily redraw the boundaries to put a bit of the thumb on the scales for the Liberals to balance this. As I said, reminiscent of South Australia, there have been a number of elections during Labor's lengthy period in power in South Australia from 2022 to 2018. I think Labor lost the two-party preferred vote on all but one of those elections, and yet were able to remain in power for 16 years. So on current boundaries, the Liberal and Nationals would need a uniform swing of 9.5% to win a majority. That would get their two-party preferred all the way to 52.4%. So maybe Labor should get cocky, because Labor, the coalition, will need a pretty Herculean effort to get the swing that they will need, assuming that swing is going to be uniform, which is always a good shortcut in these circumstances. Next slide. All right, minor parties and independents. So Labor's primary vote obviously fell to earth enormously, and I've read a lot of people whose intellectual acumen I doubt point to the 18% primary vote swing against Labor as if it's some sort of big deal and bodes ill for Labor. Obviously that's nonsense. What we're seeing here is a planet Earth election result after a different, the 2021 result that obviously wasn't going to be repeated. Nonetheless, Labor's primary vote did fall slightly short of 2017 in the context of an election where they handily won more seats in 2017, and there's another sign of the times. This is part of the long-term secular decline in support for the major parties. The obverse of which is that the minor party and independent vote is increasing. So the non-major party vote was 25.4%. That is in the ballpark of the other two most recent state elections, Queensland and Northern New South Wales. A little bit lower, and that little bit lower shouldn't be dismissed too lightly. Labor are still winning votes that in other contexts would be defecting to the the above column. There, the Labor brand in Western Australia is still strong enough to win the votes of the sort of voter who is casting around for protest vote vehicles. Very unusually, however, that 25.4% yielded absolutely nothing for the minor parties and independents collectively understood, and that is a very different state of affairs from New South Wales and Queensland. In New South Wales, there were a brace of independents who used to be shooters, fishers and farmers members, Basically, rural New South Wales, a lot of independents, effectively independents, have managed to get entrenched there. That simply hasn't happened over the last few electoral cycles in Australia, and none of them were able to knock a seat over here. And in Queensland, you've got Katter's Australia Party, you've got a couple of regional independents. In Western Australia, I think part of the phenomenon comparing us to Queensland here is that the National Party are an effective vehicle for a rural protest vote, and the Liberal National Party in Queensland simply don't perform that role. I think a lot of people who would be voting for Katter's Australia Party in Queensland are happy to vote for the National Party here. I think a fair few of them might be happy to vote for the National Party in Queensland if it was indeed the National Party, but it's that merged entity for the Liberal National Party that has the advantage to them that they're able to run a united front at state election campaigns, but it does come at that cost. They do lose regional seats to independents or, Katter's Australia Party, which is, a quasi-independent phenomenon. There were, however, an increase in non-major parties reaching the final count, so, every child wins a prize in that respect. There was only one seat in 2017, and 5 in 2022. I think I might have that the other way around. I have got that the other way around. There was only one final two-party candidate preferred count in 2022 that wasn't between Labor and Liberal or National. So this time there were a couple of independents around the case place making the final count. Only Kate Hewlett and Fremantle really came close though. The Greens made the final count in Bibra Lake. The others are all, independent candidates. Congratulations, you got 10 to 15% of the vote, but you got flogged by Labor at the final count. The two that run closest, broadly speaking, both of them were broadly speaking, as I say, tails. Kate Hewlett in Fremantle. I want the record to note that I was against the Channel 9 calling Fremantle for Kate Hewlett on the night, but no one listens to me. They had their silly little bloody gimmicky thing where they punt their defeated members through goalposts or whatever ridiculous thing they do. And Simone McGurk was there. Simone, if you're out there, that was everyone's fault but mine. Rachel Horncastle in Cottesloe, 5.6%, didn't attract a huge amount of attention because the Liberal Party won that seat on the primary vote, but she did creditably. She didn't do as well as Kate Chaney, obviously, but she had a late start and put in a pretty good show, and there's another sign of the times for you. The Greens made the final count in Bibra Lake. Yeah, congratulations, but they lost by 14.2%. Ordinarily, you'd expect the one seat they would make it to be Fremantle, but Kate Hewlett squeezed them out, and that's something to keep in mind for the Greens going forward. I think certain seats that the Greens have been having their eyes on, they're actually going to find competition from Teal independents. Federal implications, if any. I have slightly crudely, I figured no one's going to check my maths here, transposed state onto federal results and calculated where I think the difference lies. How long have I got over? People looking at their watches impatient about me yet? I mean, how long have I got though?
10 minutes?
Oh, well, I haven't got enough time. I've got too much time. All right, then I will luxuriate in this exquisitely boring slide that I saved to the end for that reason. No, it's not. Actually, it's probably really interesting. You would like to know, obviously, what implications are for the state election. This, of course, assumes that there are commonalities between state and federal voting intention, which is true up to a point. Were that not true, we would not have seen such a huge improvement for Labor at both state and federal level over the last two electoral cycles. So the big picture takeout that I have made here is that I think this bodes well for Labor in Tangney and less well in Bullwinkle. Not that I would be putting an enormous amount of money on Labor winning Tangney, but as Labor's position across the board improves, I've noticed that Labor are now actually ahead in booking markets in Tangney now. And I think they're kind of competitive in Bullwinkle as well. Whereas if you'd asked me a couple of months ago, I'd have almost said that, those seats are just going to revert to type. So Labor can at least dream the dream in those seats, particularly in Tangney, which is the kind of seat that was coming through in my Liberal Heartland calculation, where you've got sort of the Applecross, Riverton, these sorts of areas. Labor, these are the areas in which there's a sort of cultural shift against the Liberal Party and maybe Labor can eke out another win in a seat that, they will always find very difficult at best. And, before 2021, I'd have told you were dreaming if Labor were going to win Tangney. I thought the game was always, Swan, Pearce, Hasler. Conversely, Labor did not do so well. Labor lost a seat in Kalamunda. That's an interesting sort of thing to focus on, that, Labor won Kalamunda in 2017. They didn't win it this time. And if you keep going beyond that, there was, as a point that I've made a number of times now, quite substantial swings against Labor outside the metropolitan area. Bullwinkle is sort of the hills plus the Avon Valley. So that was not an area that Labor did well at the state election, and if you extrapolate that federally, it's going to be difficult to win. There is a notional Labor margin of 2.73%, depending on whose figures you trust, in that new seat. So if voting patterns in 2022 behaved exactly as they did this time on that boundary, Labor would have won, approaching 3%. But my feeling is that these sorts of margins get a bit flattering when you don't have an incumbent member defending the seat. And that's the case for Bullwinkle. If Labor will be having a good night if they win Bullwinkle, but we're now at the point where I would not be ruling out a good night for Bullwinkle. There was a poll today that targeted 20 marginal seats, all in one big collective, and it showed a 1.5% swing to Labor since the last election. And yesterday there was a YouGov poll which showed Labor holding up, so we'll see if they do that well. I'm a little bit sceptical, but if they do, then maybe Labor are competitive in Bullwinkle, which I would not have reckoned on just a couple of months ago. Less happily, that last point that I've made there, I have calculated that Greens' preferences are not as robust as they were at the 2022 federal election, where Labor did exceptionally well on preferences. This is something that opinion pollsters have been trying to get a bead on. Everyone looks at their two-party preferred vote, but this has to make assumptions about how people will behave on preferences. When you ask people what they're going to do on preferences, they don't always answer that reliably. So usually the best approach from one election to the next is to use the same preference flows at the previous election. I think in this case, though, when you do that, you're going to get slightly flattering results for Labor, and an indication of that is that 82%'s pretty good historically, but it's not the 85.5% of Greens preferences that Labor got in Western Australia. And this is not specific to the Greens. Minor parties and independents across the board, Labor are going to struggle to match the strength of those preference flows that they achieved in 2021/2. All right, my final slide is the Legislative Council, which the poor old WAC is copying a pillaring for not having resolved yet. I try to be understanding towards electoral commissions, partly because I am nervous about the Donald Trump precedent. I, think that we have so much to be thankful for our independent electoral commissions, that I try to be indulgent when they take 7 weeks or however long it's been to finish a legislative council count. And having said that, though, and to the extent that they didn't do well, I do not know to what degree it was, the contingency of human incompetence, or it's just that they're not being well resourced enough. And I would also make the point that it's very tough to hire a good quality workforce in a strong labour market. And it's very tough to be an organisation that does very little for 3.5 years and then has 6 months of mad frenzy. And I feel their pain here as an election analyst. Sort of 80% of the work I do in my life is crammed into these 4-week intervals. So if I'm speaking in tongues at the moment, that's the reason. This is a pretty intense period for me, and I have that in common with electoral commissions. What do we have though? Well, what we have, we know the big picture, which is that the Greens will hold the balance of power, and that the Greens, in addition to Labor, will have a majority between them, and it's a question of whether or not there'll be a buffer of perhaps 2 extra seats. On top of that, obviously Labor did not repeat their extraordinary result of 2021 in winning a majority in the upper house. As a result of that, they were finally able to achieve their dream of abolishing rural vote weighting there. But they, in doing so, they came up with a system that, did ensure that I don't think, short of another 2021, that any major party is going to have a majority in the Legislative Council again. The system did its job. You would expect it to. It's not too complicated a system. It is in some of its mathematics, but it's not in its basic principle, which is that the share of seats you get ends up being the share of votes you receive. I will give a brick back to the Electoral Commission now. They have not provided us with any indication whatsoever as to how below the line votes have gone. They have only published results for above the line votes. Come on, I think you can do better than that at least. Anthony Green, however, has calculated what he thinks the final result will look like when you take the above the line votes and add what the below the line votes are likely to be, taking into account the peculiarities of the below the line votes. And you can get a sense of those peculiarities by comparing the percentage column and the AG-est column. Labor go down, Liberal go down, Greens go up. What that tells you is that Greens voters like voting below the line, and major party voters, Labor Party voters especially on the whole, do not. So as a result, when those below the line votes are added, we're going to see that I thought at first that the Liberals were going to win an 11th seat. Now probably it looks like they're only going to win 10. So what is the rest of the crossbench going to look like? We're going to see, a bunch of parties probably on one seat, possibly two in the case of One Nation. Certainly we'll see One Nation legalise cannabis and Australian Christians in the mix. Sophie Mormont, who used to be a legalised cannabis MLC, may win as an independent. Animal Justice, I doubt Animal Justice will win, but it's not impossible. One party that's not going to win is Shooters, Fishers and Farmers, and I'd like to have a stern word with them, because they committed a ridiculous error in having themselves identified on the ballot paper as SFFPWA. And they have now worked out that 2/3 of their voters vote for the party as an impromptu decision because they like their name. So that was a ridiculous rookie error, and they would, I think, undoubtedly have won a seat. Maybe I'm going too far. I think they very probably would have won a seat if they had identified themselves on the ballot paper as Shooters, Fishers and Farmers. So I don't make it my business to, give them advice, but if you're out there, Shooters, Fishers and Farmers, get that right next time. Apparently, Stop Pedophiles Protect Kiddies tragically failed to win a seat. They used to travel under the somewhat more sober name of the Democratic Labor Party. They had the right idea. An eye-catching name gets you a long way, but I think Western Australian voters have at least some sense of the absurd in a negative sense. And 0.9%, do better next time. And the Libertarians didn't do well, and there's another example of what's in a name. They, I think, deceived themselves into thinking that they were part of a libertarian tide. No, people were confused because your name had Liberal in it. Now you're not allowed to do that anymore, and the cause of libertarianism needs to rebuild its brand name from the ground up. And I think that that's a respectable amount of time discharged.
All right.
So thank you very much.
Thanks. Look, this was an excellent state election result in many ways, because it was a strong endorsement of the state government, and it'll give Roger Cook a lot of confidence going forward, having been elected in his own right now. Also, generational change. So, as we've often talked about before, if you've been to these forums before, and I know many of you have, expectations are very important, and when everyone expects one side to win, it can create an environment where protest votes and grievances are amplified. On the other hand, if the swings are significantly less than expected, then that sends a message. The fact that the government got a big swing at one election does not mean that things can't swing back very dramatically at the next if the issues and the circumstances create the right environment. And we all remember that we saw that when Campbell Newman got thrown out in Queensland by a very small band of Labor members. It's about who addresses the issues that are important to people and connects with voters with some genuineness and integrity. which I'm sure Jeff, counted a long way towards your result. With the WA Labor government, there's been solid financial management and cost of living relief through electricity rebates. Some would say too slow to increase spending in key health areas and education, but that's not an area where the Liberals can credibly resonate without very clear policies. There's been solid support for jobs through infrastructure projects and policies that favour small business and tradies and industries such as mining, and a strong emphasis on building skills through TAFE. Again, some people might want a different balance on mining, but they won't be voting Liberal. So, the health system has some major strengths. Very gradually improving in areas where there were some very, very real problems. Health is an area that can erode support for governments very quickly. You can look to South Australia, but also here in history to see how that's happened. And it was one that desperately needed to be fixed in the early years of the last term of government. Our bed ratios and emergency bed ratios were poor and so forth, but there's been a lot done and more promised in those areas. There have been some important moves on the environment which have been a bit quiet, such as actually ending old growth logging and working on national parks and marine parks. And there is a strong core belief that Labor will always be better on the environment than the Liberals and Nationals. So we continue to see the benefits of keeping Western power and synergy in public hands, which has been a long, hard-fought campaign in this state, and also our gas reservation policy, and we're seeing all the problems that they're having in the east. So on these major issues, Labor has done well. Also, there have been no major scandals, no parade of ministers having to resign for poor conduct, and we've got women in a major sort of range of roles. We also ended the cap on public sector wages, which was important. In the first term, we also had people being moved from short-term contracts to more permanent employment and longer contracts. So there have been consistent themes of diversifying our industries, supporting jobs, building skills, and therefore access to jobs, and building public transport, now more affordable, to increase access to education and jobs for people in outer areas, particularly young people. Look, I just have never met too many soft Liberal voters who would disagree with any of that. There hasn't been a lot of scope for the Liberals to carve out an area for themselves if they couldn't get down to brass tacks and work out some proper policies. For the Liberals' part, they've had disunity with the clan problem still lingering, Basil Zemplis hovering. They didn't get solidly behind Libby Mettam and build her profile over the year leading up to the election in the way that Labor did with Mark McGowan. They didn't have a raft of cohesive policies that connected with people's concerns. They just relied on saying costs have gone up and there are problems in health. Basil Zemplis has a high profile, but with his background as a sports commentator, his gaffes and behaviour as Lord Mayor, his image is brash, determined and outspoken, but no link with any policies or issues that people care about. And there's no particular image of him as a relatable person either at this stage. People will not vote for a major party that doesn't seem to be serious about being able to govern and doesn't have clear policies that address key issues that people are concerned about. Now let's just pull back a little bit and look at how all this fits into the much broader political issues of our time, which I'm sure you're all very well aware of. In Australia, volatility where people change their vote in different elections has been growing steadily since 1990. We've talked about that a lot. Globally and in Australia, distrust in politicians and the political process has been growing. Many feel politicians are just in it for themselves, don't care enough about the ordinary person. Many sectors have been privatised or corporatised, so blue-collar workers who are skilled and semi-skilled have had to become small business people and have suffered much more uncertainty in their incomes, and they've felt very abandoned in the political arena over the last 25 to 30 years. Around the world, there's been rising inequality, a rise in support for right-wing populist politicians, and a rise in post-truth politics, where reality and truth are sort of melting away. So we've now got Donald Trump, who's hastening to end American dominance, and quite a few other things we hold dear. So the reasons why people vote for people like Trump, apart from the cult-like craziness, is that they've been left behind by globalisation, and institutions in their countries are no longer serving them, only vested interests. They don't feel like anyone is listening, and they don't feel like they can influence what's happening in their communities. Working people in the US don't feel the Democrats understand their issues to the degree that's needed to win. There are still a lot of people who vote Democrat, obviously, and their vote was much higher in the last presidential election than the media would have you believe. But there was a lot of magical thinking on the part of those who did vote for Trump, imagining that he would address those issues. But the problems won't go away with Trump. We need much better progressive politicians on the global stage to address these really fundamental issues that people are facing. So again, what's happened in WA over the past 8 years, we haven't been blind to all this happening in the United States and the reason why Trump was elected the first time. And so that has had an influence on what's happened in WA over the past 8 years, to particularly sharpen up the fact that there has been an emphasis on jobs and skills for working people, bringing work back in-house where that can be done beneficially, such as the Water Authority, and having an eye on policies that assist small business. Also diversifying and getting more things made here, such as the trains. There are issues, but it's a start. And very fundamentally, Mark McGowan's pandemic response, which you'll remember from the presentation after that 2021 election, based on the principle of protecting people's health and livelihoods, restored a lot of faith that politicians could put the community first. And again, that was particularly for working people who can't just stay home. And as I said at the time, people felt that they weren't sleeping so that we could. And that was a reversal of the politicians weren't sleeping, notably Mark and Roger, so that the public could rest more easily and get on with their lives. So that was a restoration of faith on a considerable scale in Western Australia, and it was reflected in the extraordinary vote that was achieved in that election. It also brought the community together a lot more, which is another important feature in protecting democratic values. We have other advantages in Australia, which include our compulsory voting and our preferential voting. And we also have an opposition and a leader of the opposition. I mean, we might find all that fairly annoying at different times, but we're really seeing the lack of that in American politics at the moment. Bit of comment on the federal stuff. Federally, it seemed like the Albanese government was bound for defeat last year. However, Peter Dutton is showing himself to be hopelessly out of touch. Again, there's a lack of well thought out policies. Things seem to be happening on the fly, even at this late stage. He's not coming across as exceptionally bright or comfortable, and he also looks a bit lonely. Anthony Albanese's become a lot more comfortable in his communication. That's been great. With the Trump destructiveness and uncertain times, the government is looking very steady, and Jim Chalmers is very solid treasurer. Meanwhile, Dutton has flirted with messaging on trans issues, cutting public sector jobs, and whatever else. in a reasonably transparent go at copying what that guy did, until he noticed that it wasn't going very well. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, federal elections that are very tight will be determined in a few important seats, state-by-state factors, big local issues, prominent local candidates. So that overall picture only gets us to the point of it being close. We'll see how those regional factors play out on the night. Looking, to the future, we've got really big global tides going on here, and we're not in any way immune from them, even though I think was reflected in the way this session was advertised, Western Australia is almost best placed. Australia very well placed, and Western Australia even better placed to deal with them. However, we have to acknowledge that they're there. So to protect our democracy into the future, we need to strengthen our democratic institutions very, very strongly, protecting the ABC, improving the quality of education and access to education, reducing inequality, and improving our universal health system and building communities, engaging with local communities. When it comes to addressing inequality in Australia, the lack of social housing, housing insecurity, cost of rent or purchasing a home are at the centre of that problem for us, and they're a very big problem in Western Australia as well. We also need local members, state and federal, listening to people and engaging with community groups. So, in coming back to our state again, I've heard from people in education and other places that the general anxiety has risen in the outer suburbs since Trump got elected, and I suspect people are feeling a lot of uncertainty about how things are going to go. And there are a lot of issues for the state government to keep going with. Housing, the very big one, increasing supply through more social housing and affordable housing, access to services for people escaping domestic violence, continuing to increase professional assistance for teachers in schools with the issue that they're dealing with, which are just blowing out more and more, and also radically improving our juvenile justice system, which I understand is actually happening quietly. A lot of kids being diverted from Banksia Hill. And mitigating the effect of climate change, to name a few. A couple of little comments on the things that William said. Our regional cities are, yes, and very much a case-by-case look needed there, as well as the sort of global trends we're seeing in the fact that people in those areas don't have the access to the same economic opportunities that people in the city have. But I mean, Albany has been a pitch battle every single time since it was first won. So over that 20 years, Albany was never an easy win. Much older community down there with a lot of retired farmers and so forth. And Geraldton, the boundaries move. I think we've got a lot of Greenough in Geraldton now, have we?
Yeah, it just absorbed Kalbarri, which probably didn't help.
Yeah.
And, it used to be before one vote, one value, it was just the city of Geraldton.
Yeah.
And now it's that whole sort of partly wheat belt Greenough sort of area, as you say, yes.
Yes. So, I mean, with those regional cities and the regional areas in general, that is a case book in what we've been talking about, or what I've been talking about in terms of people having to engage very strongly with the local issues, the local communities, and to work through what people in those communities need to have more opportunities and to address their health, access to healthcare and ability to transport, to travel to the places they need to get to and all that sort of stuff. I would also just add that in the metropolitan area we've got increasingly diverse communities now. For a long time we've had a lot of immigration from English-speaking countries. We now have a lot of much more diverse communities, and our local members need to be working very closely with a very broad range of community groups now for people to feel like they're being heard and that they're able to participate fully in our community and benefit from what we're all hopefully benefiting from.
Hi everyone. I thought you'd probably want to hear from the experts and not a political hack like me, so I'll keep this relatively brief. I'm conscious that that Jeff is in the room and I don't want to give out too many trade secrets lest he tell my boss that I'm spilling everything. So I'd sort of like to say that I worked in CHQ during the campaign, in the local campaigns team. We coordinate the efforts of local campaigns on the ground, but it was local campaigns that were the primary drivers behind the result that you see on the screen there. As many of you know, we did this via door knocking and phone banking. I ran some checks the other day, and between the 1st of January and the 8th of March, WA Labor's volunteers on the ground held 329,728 conversations with voters, which is a huge result. In those conversations, our message to voters was pretty simple. This election was a choice between Roger Cook and Libby Metham, or Basil Zemplis. It was a choice between a stable, experienced government that was delivering on the economy, cost of living, transport, infrastructure, education and health, and a chaotic, risky, inexperienced opposition. We had a good story to tell and a strong record to stand on. And early on, we'd identified some key demographics towards which we would direct this messaging, and through which we believe the election would be won. Because if you're a campaigner, there's just simply no point talking to Russet-on Labor and Liberal voters. It's just a bit of a waste of your time, if I'm honest. You want to talk to soft, what we call persuadable voters. And part of that, there's an increase in the soft and persuadable vote, and that goes to probably what William was saying earlier about the decline in the primary vote of the major parties. Probably talk about that a little bit later. So there were two main groups that we targeted actually with our door knocking, and one was broadly called the family battler, which consisted mainly, I would call females aged between 30 and 45. They were in work, they had dependent children, they were under financial pressure. They normally worked in non-professional managerial roles, tradies, community or personal service workers. High school or TAFE, vocational training is often the highest level of education that they'd achieved. They were born in Australia and had no private health insurance. Their typical media diet, they were more likely to get their news through streaming services and digital platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. They were less likely to listen to radio, watch the evening 6 p.m. news or read newspapers like the West Australian. They were probably the biggest group that we targeted and probably the easier of the two to reach. The other one was the young achiever, what I'd call the young achiever, which was an even split male and female. They were 30 and under, they were in work. Again, they had high school or TAFE, vocational training was the highest level of education they'd achieved. They were normally labourers or non-professionals. Some were born overseas or were first generation Australians and therefore spoke another language at home. They were renting or had a mortgage. They didn't own their homes outright. They were members of a union, oddly enough, which is great. They may have had a young family, but many didn't have dependent children. And that weirdly enough, they listened to Talkback a lot, which I don't really understand. I listened to Talkback quite a lot. I watch current affairs as well, like they did. But they were definitely less likely to read newspapers, and they had really high social media usage, especially Instagram, YouTube and TikTok. And I only say this because it's these two groups that sort of spell out the problem for major political parties like the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. The battleground middle is sort of made up overwhelmingly of young people who have completely different media diets from their parents, are confronting different economic realities as compared with their parents, and have different political priorities, especially with respect to the environment and climate change. They'll continue to exert their influence in elections as they age, and the battle to win their votes will only become more and more competitive. And the battles that we fight with, just, Greens voters and I'm speaking from a Labor perspective. I understand this is a mixed audience here. From in inner metropolitan seats as compared with outer suburban seats, it varies as you go. This is evidence that some of the biggest corrections, which William pointed out, came from seats like Rockingham, with the Mark McGowan factor now long gone, Fremantle, Forestfield, Secret Harbour, Lansdale, Midland, Swan Hills and Butler. And that means we're in the weird position where given a uniform two-party preferred swing of 9.5% is what would bring a Liberal National Party to government. Mandurah is now a line of government seat on 9.53%, which is just incredible. In an election dominated by cost of living, it's notable that some of the more affluent southern suburb seats, like Riverton, which is my home seat, Bigton, Bateman and South Perth, Jeff, shout out to you, were spared some of the more vicious swings. These are not traditional Labor seats, and it's strange, but I'm happy to be standing up or sitting down here as it happens, and calling seats like these 2 and 3 term Labor seats. The results in these areas might reflect a different lived experience that isn't as exposed to cost of living, which was the main line of messaging that the government, the Labor Party, ran and tried to counter this election. And the general experience of some of WA Labor's target voters that I outlined before, as compared with those living in outer suburban areas. CHQ and local campaigns on the ground worked hard to consolidate our gains, and including the surprise ones from 2021, and even harder to win over our target voters in seats all around WA. And we'll have to work even harder to keep them in the future with the decline in the primary vote. I really don't have all that much, and I'd much rather hear from you two, if I'm honest. So, thank you.